totally committed and on board with HTML5 and love it very much. And then I tell the audience, hey, look, even the lawyers are learning how to speak the language of the web, so you better do it too, or you're really going to get screwed. And then we move on to the ascendancy of JavaScript and how that's going to change your life. And Dave just gave us a really good presentation on that. I tell you some of the important things that HTML5 does for you. Maybe even show you some code if I'm feeling really generous that evening. And then I make a good-natured swipe at Internet Explorer. Dave did that for me earlier. Thank you for the great lead-in. And then I tell you really what you need to do to bring unicorns and rainbows into the world is get on board with HTML5 for mobile development, and that's how it's going to be. And being right is really, really great until you're not. And in September of last year, just before a DevMeetup in Denver, Mark Zuckerberg gave an interview, as he was wont to do every once in a while, and said, hey man, we went all in on HTML5 and totally got hosed. We lost 2 years. The multi-platform demands that Facebook placed on itself meant that HTML5 just wasn't there for what they wanted to do yet. The other thing that has sort of changed my tune a little bit is I've moved on from a previous employer to a new employer, where the fact of the matter is, for me, most of my user audience doesn't care about the back office. The device is the thing. It's a Trimble, it's a disconnected tablet, it's a tough book. It's something that's not ever connected because we work in the asset collection space, and they're going into a swamp in the middle of Louisiana, they're going out on the tundra in Alaska, they're responding to a disaster where connections are down, and if the data and the functionality and the features aren't on the device in their chip, they simply don't exist. And they never come back to the office to sync up, ever. A little yellow Trimble box just sits in their truck. Now the other thing is that a lot of my clients have 1 or 2 or 5 people that are certified to go out and do asset inventory with a high accuracy GPS device, but they have 200 people that do inspections and maintenance and work orders. And putting a $9,000 high accuracy device in their hands simply isn't an option. And so, you know, we're faced in the technology realm right now with needing to make a switch to take advantage of a consumer device that's already in the user's hand. Because they got it for 99 bucks, or they bought, 18 iPads for the price of a Trimble, or whatever the case may be. And that's sort of how I decided to take a look at Android development, move into a little uncomfortable space for me, and sort of start this research and development initiative. And so tonight I'd like to just sort of introduce some fun facts about, what is the Android operating system. And you go out on the street and say, hey, who invented Android? 9 out of 10 people on the street will tell you Google did. Google actually bought Android in the same year that they launched Google Maps. And based on the latest mobile device usage statistics for operating systems, I think it was a pretty good and forward-looking investment, right? It is a Linux system. It's based on a Linux 2.6 kernel. And what Linux got them was a proven driver model, security at the process level, and a few other things. And Android incorporated surfaced that with a whole bunch of stuff. It means you don't have to interact at that low level. You may be surprised to learn, as I was, that operating system that runs on that diminutive device in your pocket is approximately 12 million lines of code. And they were kind enough to give us an app layer that is Java-based, so we don't have to worry about the C and C++ that is interacting with the Linux kernel down below. So if you're going to do Android development and you are a .NET developer or a JavaScript or PHP or whatever else, the first step in your process, of course, is going to be to set up a development environment. And my first crack was setting up a development environment and getting it to build and run on my Windows machine. Like so many things that we have learned since Steve Jobs gave us the iPhone, things on Apple devices just tend to work. And I spent about 3 days modifying environment variables, changing home directories, etc., and finally installed Eclipse on my MacBook, and things just worked. And And so that would be my input if you're going to do this development. I actually, this morning, went into work, needed more space on my MacBook, and deleted my Windows partition. Because I can do all that development on this nice, shiny silver thing. You can all go out and Google. There are hundreds and hundreds of links that will tell you how to set up an Android development on your device. So I won't belabor the point here. But in general, you're going to have to install Java and Eclipse. Anyone that's ever visited a website probably is already running Java without knowing it. You also got Yahoo Toolbar for free with that, so you'll need to install the Android SDK. You will need to install the Android Developer Tools plugin, which gets you all the nice IDE integration, and also gets you an emulator, which is which meets with mixed reviews in terms of speed and efficiency. The one thing that surprised me is that when you do all that stuff and you go through that process, you don't actually get Android. You have to tell Eclipse that you want to install some new software and go out and download the Android API versions that you want to support. So those are sort of the four main steps that you go through to get started. In Esri land, you'll go out to the Esri Resource Center and you'll download the Esri Android SDK. Very detailed instructions out there of how to get that up and running. That gives you some nice SDK integration as well, create new Esri Android project and things from the file menu. And while you're getting ready to put your own pencil through your eye, setting up and using Eclipse, you will be comforted by the fact that this is all free, right? But it's free like a puppy, not free like a beard. So eventually Eclipse will be on your carpet, and you just need to be good with that. Getting started, there are sort of three things you need to be familiar with in the Android environment to get any work done. And the first is this concept of an intent. And intents on the Android platform work a little bit like a message bus. You say, I want to spin up an intent. My intent is to use the camera, and I want you to hand me a result back. Your application fires that message off and waits for a picture to come back. Inside an intent are various activities that you can write and create. And an activity is essentially the screen you're looking at when you download and fire up the Esri Android application and you see a map. That is an activity. That is essentially the .exe in Windows land that you're running. And these activities can spin off other activities. The other sort of interesting thing in Android land that it took me a while to wrap my head around is that any piece of application code can launch any other application's piece of code. And that's how I'm able to say, hey, when I click on the map, that means I want to take a picture. When I click on a button on a form, that means I want to launch the contacts that are already on the phone, and I want to select a contact and have it return the phone number to me, etc., etc. It takes a little bit of time to wrap your head around what's going on because this is what formulates what is known as the backstack. I don't know why they didn't call it history because it's the same thing as history in the browser. But the smart kids decided it was the backstack. And I want to jump in now, and let's just assume I'm going to jump beyond the file new project point because we're all, most of us are developers or out on a bad date and don't care. So we've created a new project, and when you're developing in Eclipse, there's a variety of other IDEs, but Eclipse is probably the best and the worst IDE at the same time. The first thing you're going to be concerned with is the Android manifest file. And this is where you say, this is what my application is. This is the permissions it has. Permissions in Android are at the process level, at the code level. And by default, your application has no permissions to do anything on an Android device until you expressly permit it. And so this little section of code up here where it says uses permission, I have internet access, find location on the GPS, and I can access external storage. Those are the things you see when you go into the App Store and it says, hey, when you install this app, it's going to be able to do the following 3 things. Are you good with that? So you have to declare that stuff explicitly. And then you simply say, hey, my application is made up of this activity here. It's a Cartapack activity, that's where I work. And it's going to use default. Typically what you would do if you don't, I've got a splash screen down here that's running while this application is initialized, but typically you would say, hey, the intent I'm going to use is Launcher. And Launcher is one of these things you get for free on Android, and it's just going to spin up whatever the default activity for your application is. You'll notice we live in a world that likes REST and JSON now. If you're going to do Android development, you need to get used to the idea that you're going to be working in XML land an awful lot, because the manifest, a lot of the configuration, a lot of the resource files are all XML based. It's this interesting combination of XML and code that makes everything work. The second thing you're going to need to worry about in Android land is layouts and views. So this is what's going to show on the screen when my activity starts up, right? This is a relative layout. There are a whole list of layouts that are supported on Android right now. Tabular layout, which is exactly what you think it is. A linear layout that does things either horizontally or vertically in a line. Relative layout is essentially, I get to explicitly say where buttons and maps and text boxes and things appear on the screen relative to each other. This layout is actually Andy Cupp's layout. It's out on GitHub because this is the layout for the Esri Quick Start application. And the third thing that you need to worry about is your activity. And this is the code that runs your application. This spins up the UI and shows it. Probably has some event wire up, some business logic, and it does stuff. Okay? When I click on the map, this is what I want to happen. When I click on this button, I want it to go send an email or take a picture, etc., etc. This is the Hello World example from the Esri samples, and we're essentially saying, look, go into whatever the default view is, that relative layout I just showed you, find me the map and stick a tiled layer in. Okay, go show me World Street Map from ArcGIS Online, and this all fires in the onCreate for your activity. This is sort of the main in the Windows console app, right? The other thing you can do in here is, this is a giant file that I wrote when I was doing this R&D. In that onCreate, you're also setting up all your event handlers. So when I single tap on the map, I want you to do a bunch of stuff. And this is where you're going to include all the application logic for what's running on that screen at that time. If you click on a map and do something else, like launch an editable form, it's going to spin up another activity, which is going to call the onCreate method and configure that form and that view, etc. So as I was going through this, this process of R&D and how do I jump into this and do development, etc., the tools that Esri provides you with their SDK and with some additional tooling in ArcGIS Online enabled me to get up an app with switching out base maps back and forth, controlling the GPS unit through the location service on the device, executing some search functions, selecting, editing, and creating new features. With all the hair pulling and what do I do now, it probably took me about 2 days, which really isn't bad to get up and running. But it also gives you a lot of respect for people that are doing things like putting Angry Birds on your phone. My initial impressions of Android in general, you notice I haven't talked a lot about the Esri SDK. And that's because the Android SDK calls what? Calls the REST API. So if you use the JavaScript API or you've done Silverlight or Flex development, how many different ways are there to add a layer to a map? Map.add layer, give me a URL, right? So All that stuff is fairly well understood. I came from a C# background, so did a lot of JavaScript development as well. So Java was very familiar to me. JavaScript, Java, not the same. Thank you, David. When you're doing Android development, it's very important to understand the application and activity lifecycle, because your application, you don't ever get to close your application. You're developing with the Android SDK, and you fire up an app, and then you say, yeah, I'm going to go away from there and make the phone call. That app is still running. And it creates this backstack that you can page back through. So you need to understand that you need to pause your application and stop handling events when you leave that app. When the operating system randomly decides that your app is getting axed next, you need to gracefully handle de-scoping things. Let's go back for a minute. I'm going to give you a reference in a few minutes to the developer.android.com site, and you should follow all those guidelines. I ran into some pain points and tried to do some things differently than the smart kids did out there from Google. And what you'll immediately notice is that in your debugger, your heap explodes. And you start leaking memory badly. So you should follow the guidelines of those that have come before you. Debugging in Android is still confusing to me and very complex. And I would actually recommend avoiding the emulator, because essentially, when you say, I want to launch my app, I want to debug it, and I want to do it in the emulator on my development machine, you're spinning up an instance of Linux in memory. And really, having that little black cable connecting your device to your development machine is not a black eye, and it's going to launch a lot faster and run a lot easier, and you're going to still get the debug output from the device. Coming from a Windows development background, I'm used to saying, hey, I'm in Windows and I want to launch a new thread to do this now. And I'm going to explicitly handle what happens when that thread terminates. There's threading all over in the Android development platform that you're not necessarily aware is happening. And the first time I launched an app in the debugger and started debugging, I was bouncing from window to window, back and forth, and I didn't understand what was happening. And a lot of the event handling paradigms are happening in an asynchronous manner. So it's important to sort of get a grip on the fact that that's going on and understand what it means for your application. The other thing I realized relatively quickly was that all my history in Microsoft development land has spoiled me in terms of tooling and references and sort of instrumentation that does things for me. Automatically generating tests, automatically generating templates and scaffolding, etc. In an Esri-specific perspective, I will tell you, and this should not be a surprise, I'm sure any of you that are on an Esri email list have heard something called ArcGIS Online. When you talk to an Esri employee, you're required to mention that term 15 times in conversation before the end of the chat. And things are tailored and are going to become more tailored in the mobile API realm to provide much less friction if you just use ArcGIS Online for some things. For example, that app that was on the screen earlier, the screenshots of the phone in the editable form, you get the editable form for free. And you do not have to lay it out yourself if you use ArcGIS Online and you use a webmail. Other things are much more bare metal, so great. My first impression when I first just built Hello World was I get a map with pinch and pan. And everything else is very close to the metal on the Android platform, and you're left to handle those things yourself. The first application that I wrote did almost nothing, switched base maps and did a simple search. It was almost 1,000 lines of code. I'll give you a way to get around that here just a little bit. And the eventing and handlers doesn't seem to have a centralized story. I mean, you know you need to hook up on click, you know you need to hook up on long press. But beyond that, there's little guidance on how to deal with events in the mapping environment, and you'll have to write that code on your own. The upgrade process, I started developing on Android version 2, and then I upgraded to the, I think it was 10.2 that dropped a month or two ago. And I spent a day and a half trying to get stuff I'd already wrote to run again. So hopefully that sort of upgrade story becomes a little more clear and has a little less friction in it going forward. The other thing that concerns me now is the offline story. We can do offline now by simply writing everything to SQLite. There's a whole bunch of infrastructure changes that need to happen in order for true offline functionality to be integrated on the Esri platform from the device all the way back to the enterprise geodatabase. The constant example I always use is, hey, I go out in the field and I want to do inventory on an asset, and Sally Sue back in the office deletes the asset while I'm out there. Who wins when I get a connection again? So some resources for everyone to take advantage of. Developer.android.com is actually really well done. And you can sit there and read it like an encyclopedia if you want. There are UI design recommendations, implementation recommendations. This is the way you do dialogues and messaging and services and everything else. Very good information out there. Obviously, you'll download and take advantage of resources.rgis.com an awful lot. This, for a very early Esri API, is very well done and has a wealth of information on how to do things and how to make your life easier. Esri's on GitHub. Andy mentioned this earlier, and I want to give a specific shout out to a project that was uploaded by Andy Gutt, the Esri Quick Starter, because he has written a library that will dramatically streamline your coding process. So hey, give me a map with a bunch of layers in it, let me switch those layers, handle the GPS for me, give me a baseline event bus that I can hook into to handle events. All that stuff is done, and all you have to do is import those jar files into your project, and you're good to go. The other thing I have done, I have a new baby at home. It keeps me up late at night, and for $29 for a month, you can sit and watch Pluralsight while you're up late at night, and so that's what I've done the last month. They've got 6 courses out there now. Surely there are more to come, as big a story as Android is. And so that's an excellent resource as well, and cheap. So that's my show, and that's sort of my story of what I've experienced through this process.